As Canadians reflect on everything that's happened over the past 3 years, and we add up the lies, the incompetence, the corruption, we come to the conclusion that some of the behavior from our government and the government officials could be considered criminal. Obviously, this is wrong. This is immoral. But are there any conservative politicians of the Conservative Party of Canada saying anything about this? No. So it's up to the regular Canadian men and women who are brave enough to stand up and say something and to call out what is clearly wrong. Tonight, Danny Bulford, former RCMP officer and security detail for Justin Trudeau, joins me tonight to share his journey on leaving the establishment and deciding to do the right thing. The conversation starts now.
I promise you, I will not let you down.
The trucks parked outside illegally should move.
Canada's Conservatives will meet our Paris climate commitment.
Enough with the woke. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I take that back.
To champion our conservative principles.
We are the party of law and order.
To call in the auditors.
We haven't yet decided whether we're going to call for the government to impose a mandatory test or vaccination.
And we will win the next election. Canada must not ignore the reality of climate change.
Why weren't Canadians vaccinated in January and February like everyone else?
Welcome, everybody, to Controlled Opposition, episode 19. Tonight, I'm with a very, very special guest, RCMP for 15 years, part of the emergency response team, which is the RCMP tactical unit, and was even the sniper security detail sometimes for the one and only Justin Trudeau. And he was also helped with volunteering for safety and security down at the trucker convoy. He was arrested at the trucker convoy, but not charged. You may have seen him before. Danny Bulford, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm good. Thanks, Greg. I love the name of your show, by the way. That's brilliant.
Well, thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to have you on. Your story is a very, very important one, as you have been part of one of the most major institutions in this country, the RCMP, our federal police force, and you have taken this journey to say, stand up and stand up for what is right. And I'm sure it hasn't been an easy journey, but we're going to talk more about that this evening, what you've been doing since the convoy, and of course the common thread of where has the opposition been this whole time. And I think we'll start with that. Before the COVID era, you're working for the RCMP. Maybe you're following politics in Canada. When is the first time that you started to question the Conservative Party, or maybe just start to question, the political establishment as a whole? Were you always cynical about Canadian politics?
No, not always. And even, prior to COVID, I definitely leaned more conservative for sure. I thought at the time, Stephen Harper was, some people didn't like him, but he seemed like a very competent, intelligent man who was an extremely hard worker.
Sure.
But when I was early on in my career and I was working and living up in Yukon, I tried to keep an open mind when I really started to be like, okay, I need to take voting at least pretty seriously. I should at least know what the different parties are trying to sell and see who I align with the most. And really the only time I ever considered anyone other than Harper for PM was when Jack Layton was in charge of the NDP, or was leader of NDP. I took an honest look at their platform, but at the end of the day, I just couldn't vote for the local candidate. That was a factor in my decision making. But then, forgive me, a lot of people have jokingly criticized me for this before, but at one point in time in the federal election, when I was still living in the Yukon, I even voted for Green. And not that I was on board with the climate change agenda whatsoever. But when I was looking at the local candidates for Yukon, the Conservative guy was basically just running on what he had ran on the previous election, and that he kind of hung his hat on the gun registry, and that was it, like the abolishing of the gun registry. The Liberal I couldn't vote for, the NDP candidate I couldn't vote for, and the only guy that was like well-spoken, qualified, and articulate was the Green Party, who was like a local Yukon biologist. And I was like, well, I want Stephen Harper to be the Prime Minister out of all of the leaders that are available, but the only guy locally that I feel good about voting for would be John Stryker, who was their federal candidate at the time. But
hey, I don't think there's any shame in that. I certainly think it does make you a minority in this country, because unfortunately, Canadians don't really follow that closely what happens in Canadian politics. And I wish all of them would actually learn their local candidates in a federal election, but I really think that happens, that is the minority scenario. Most of the time, people are just saying, who's the leader of the federal party? I'm going to vote for them. But good for you for doing your due diligence as a citizen, right? To actually learn about your local options. Imagine that.
Well, but then when I transferred to Ottawa, and like you said, I was regularly involved in beefing up or supporting the protection of the Prime Minister's detail. I got to see firsthand like how Stephen Harper operated, and he has a reputation for being a workaholic, and it's true. Like that guy did was work, and his version of working was not just flitzing all over the world for photo ops and living the rock star lifestyle that our current Prime Minister does. He
wasn't singing covers of Queen at the piano or anything like that.
No, and even one time I was doing like a nighttime patrol, like foot patrol, out in around his cottage property, and I was kind of just doing something to occupy myself that night, and I was testing out night vision that we had been recently issued, and so I was doing like a little foot patrol around the property and night vision, and it was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and Prime Minister Harper was on his laptop working. Like everybody else was asleep, and I saw the little glow from the back screen of his laptop shining on his face in the window of his cottage, and I was like, he never stopped. All he did was work all the time. So long story short, to answer your question, most of the time of my life I've leaned conservative, and I think that's because of like people like him and the competence that he displayed. But I have never been like a diehard one party or the other kind of person. I try to vote for the specific leader or the specific candidate. Most of them, skepticism around the Conservatives, like that's what you asked about, right? I think probably mostly began when they were silent during all of the COVID restrictions and mandates, because it was politically risky to challenge the narrative, even though that's the opposition's job to do that.
Right.
And I was really disappointed in Aaron O'Toole as the leader during the election campaign, because I thought, this guy has it in the bag. People are done with Trudeau. They're done with all of this COVID nonsense. All he has to do is just basically say, hey, I support freedom of choice, because that's part of our charter protected rights in Canada. And I think he would have had the victory, but he didn't. He waffled and gave the typical political non-answer, and it backfired on him.
Yeah, and we were seeing clips of we're all in this together during the debates on TV during that election. Mandates were not even a debate talking point. The fact that we were just going to force mandates on everybody was sort of just this unanimous yes with the Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Green, Orange, everybody. Well,
and what shocked me the most about the Conservatives in that regard is there was plenty of evidence already available at that time, plenty of experts, plenty of evidence available to crush the government's horrendous response to COVID-19. And they could have totally taken the government to task if they had just chosen to have a little bit of courage as opposed to willful blindness. And they could have been the heroes of the day, but instead they chose to say, I call it silently safe in their mind. Mm-hmm. And that was when I lost a lot of faith in them at that time. There has been the odd individual, like certain individuals that I will openly support, like Roman Baber. He sacrificed his job and his seat and his career as well to speak out against what he thought was wrong and an injustice. So, I acknowledge him to a degree. Leslyn Lewis as well. She's been vocally opposing the globalist agenda and mandates. So I will support individuals who oppose it, but as a whole, I think the opposition failed to do their job in that last election campaign and throughout the declared pandemic. And in regards to those specific issues, they are still failing to really oppose it in a rigorous manner, right? Like, I think it's opportunistic to gain popularity when something like the Convoy is happening, and then to be completely silent on it after the fact. When, the evidence just keeps pouring out more and more and more that this was an absolute disastrous response that destroyed our economy, destroyed relationships, destroyed careers. And if they wanted to strike while the iron was hot, what are you waiting for? This could, if you had the gall to talk about these issues and present real evidence and experts who are willing to speak to it to the corporate media, they would, as the official opposition, the corporate media pretty much has no choice but to at least report on what you're saying, right? So it makes the censorship much more difficult if it's coming from the official opposition.
That's right. And because a lot of the mainstream media is at least partially subsidized now by the federal government, sure, they might report on you telling the facts as the opposition party. They might make you look bad. They might try to skew it and spin it. But in my personal opinion, the media needs to be challenged in this country, because there's that unity right now between the Liberal Party and the media. They're just like this. They're totally on board, on the same page, the exact same rhetoric, the exact same sort of values, even, and morals. And it's not being challenged right now by the opposition party. And in fact, the opposition party is playing ball with them to a large degree, except for a few kind of comments made here and there for Pierre Poilievre to pump up his chest. But yep.
They seem to have no problem challenging the media on the issues that they appear to feel are politically safe.
Right.
But for whatever reason, no one wants to talk about the harms of the COVID response. The failure of lockdowns, the failure of masks, the failure of the injections, the suppression of treatment protocols that could actually save people and keep people out of hospital, all of it. You pull one thread and the ball, it just unravels even more. But considering how much damage was inflicted by the response, I just can't fathom why you wouldn't take the opportunity to show how it was complete, utter incompetence and failure, and maybe even, likely even deliberate deception on behalf of the current government. But they stick to their safe topics that, they don't want to be labeled anti-vaxxers or anything like that, even though it's such a ridiculous term. But it's that playing safe politically, when I think what we need is some real courageous people who are willing to speak the truth. No, even if it means you become unpopular as a politician.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you nailed it with that. And I'm just going to bring this up on screen. There's other examples of this, but this is we have Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, Pierre Poilievre, and they're all, I believe that's the Green Party candidate or Green Party leader as well. But they're all marching for, I believe, is the New Year in Chinese New Year in Vancouver. And I bring this up in relation to the Chinese interference that's been happening, and they want to do an inquiry into the Chinese interference. And of course, there was the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act. There's all these inquiries going on. And I mean, well, first of all, Pierre Poilievre did not even, he basically rubber stamped the Rouleau Commission after the use of the Emergencies Act. He did not challenge this conclusion, which essentially said, yeah, you can use the Emergencies Act on a peaceful protest. You were part of that. Did you gave testimony there, right? Yeah,
I did. Yep.
And what was your feeling after? There's a specific press conference that Pierre Poilievre gave, and he spoke. He was kind of, hey, what did you think of the conclusion? And he tried to spin it in this way of like, hey, CBC, you're asking me a tough question, or like you're being biased. But he didn't really say that he stands with a treat. Like he was asked, do you regret standing with the trucker convoy? He did not answer that question, which I feel is a very simple answer. And he essentially sort of tried to be critical of the conclusion of the Rouleau Commission, but like he kind of just dropped it after that. What was your perspective on that when that happened? Because this is a pretty big deal. It's setting a legal precedent in a way that you can now, call the emergency on a peaceful protest if you feel like it, if there's honking going on, and absolutely like no violence or even vandalism really of any evidence at all.
Except against the convoy.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. There's a whole list when it comes to that. Yeah. A lot of video evidence, by the way. Evidence, keyword video evidence.
So my perspective about Pierre's response is, he is clearly an articulate speaker. He's always well prepared when he wants to go after the government for something.
Yep.
And yet here is another example of him shying away from a clear opportunity to speak truth to power and to speak truth to the media, and with all kinds of evidence to back it up. Even just from the commission itself, it was clear, no matter how much they tried to twist words from CSIS or the police agencies, not one of the major police agencies involved, Ottawa Police, OPP, RCMP, testified that they believed the criteria for the Emergencies Act had been met, nor did CSIS. And then they brought in the Prime Minister's own national security advisor to try and basically, what her testimony summarized in my mind was, I didn't like what the dedicated intelligence agencies were giving me for intelligence, so I created my own open source intelligence team to feed the narrative that these people were dangerous and therefore we needed the Emergencies Act. And yet, so the evidence was clear. They didn't meet the criteria. And even Rouleau's conclusion was not super clear cut, right? Like it was like, well, and I kind of saw this coming. I anticipated that they were going to put a lot of the blame on the police for inability to work effectively together, because the police are typically the punching bag after anything like this happens. But then there's also, Section 2 of the CSIS Act was the criteria that they had to meet in order to be justified in invoking the Emergencies Act. And it was testified to by all of the national security agencies that were involved there.
The experts,
CSIS,
if you will.
The experts that we're supposed to rely on, that it did not meet Section 2 of the CSIS Act. And then, of course, what I anticipated coming, which certainly did in the conclusion, or in the report, was a recommendation that, well, perhaps we have to expand the scope of the criteria beyond just the narrow scope of Section 2 of the CSIS Act in order to invoke to declare a national emergency and invoke the Emergencies Act. And sorry, that's a long-winded answer also, but again, clear-cut evidence, they acted inappropriately, they overstepped. You have an opportunity to take them to task with a lot of evidence to support your argument, and you don't, because it's not politically popular anymore to be, in support of the trucker convoy.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate, it's not a long-winded answer. It's a detailed answer, and these details are really, really important. And I feel it's silly, or we should wear we should put clown makeup on, Danny, if we're actually going to talk about this and say, oh, there's nothing political about this decision. Like, it's obviously this decision feels very political in nature, especially when you compare it to the recent PSAC strike for the public service workers who were shutting things down, shutting some of the same infrastructure down during their protest, and they were getting support from the media. They were getting it was this great righteous protest for the public service workers who are asking for more money, asking for more taxpayer money. And if you compare that to the way in which the truckers were treated, well, here you have this new kind of strange legal precedent where someone hired by Trudeau can now supersede the opinion of a CSIS member, and I think you said the CSIS Act, right? It's insane. And of course, who is talking about it? Who is challenging this? Because these are important details. These are the sort of the principles and the rules that make up our rule of law, and also, gives us a guide map or a guideline when these tricky situations come up. And of course, it's kind of come to the pattern of, oh, well, if you're protesting against us, against the government in a sort of meaningful way, well, we're going to kind of do what we want and change the rules however we like. Or at least that's the kind of message that I'm receiving during all this. And I can't even imagine what it's like for you, who is actually part of the RCMP at one point.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I spoke to recently when I testified for the NCI was my loss of trust in institutions, including the RCMP and the court system and everyone who's supposed to actually protect our rights and freedoms. Especially agencies like the RCMP and the courts and CSIS, who are you're supposed to be intelligence and evidence led, yet you're just going along with a narrative that has yet to really provide any solid, meaningful evidence to support what they're doing, or even what they're saying. And I'm not just talking about COVID mandates. I'm even talking about the way that the reporting and the narrative surrounding the convoy itself. You had, thankfully, we had a few officers from the OPP who actually called that out a little bit, right? Like the superintendent in charge of intelligence for all of Ontario openly said that what he was seeing in the media did not match what was truly happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. Anyway, going back though, like, I was testifying to my loss of trust in these institutions that are supposed to be intelligence-led, evidence-led, and it seems like the message I'm receiving is, does evidence even matter anymore? Or is it all based on public opinion, manipulated public opinion? Corporate media manipulated public opinion. And does the law even matter anymore? Like, the way that the law was written, you didn't meet the threshold. Oh, well, too bad, we'll just change the law to suit our purposes. Like the charter itself, it's it's part of the Constitution, which is supposed to be the supreme law of Canada, and no, your rights and freedoms aren't really rights and freedoms, it's more privileges. That's the impression that I have come away with after the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And yeah, maybe while we're on this topic of just the failures, the epic failures of these institutions, part of the reason I started this show, Controlled Opposition, is I feel like we saw the true character of this, Canadian regime, I call it sometimes now, after the trucker convoy, because, we had a peaceful protest. We had this large demonstration in a democratic nation, and there was no negotiations. There was no sort of time of day for these people at all. And of course, it was met with police violence. And I would love to hear your perspective on this, because you're a former RCMP, and you had the RCMP, on horses, literally crushing people who oppose the state. And after the dust was settled, it's like we're just kind of moving on. We're not going to talk about that happening, or we're going to justify everything that was done. How is that? Because obviously you've been an RCMP member. You believe in this country. You believe in these institutions. What was that like? That horrible moment when you were getting thrown in a police car at the Convoy. Take me to that moment of just like, how far your country had fallen in that moment.
My personal arrest story was pretty low key. I kind of had accepted the fact that as soon as they started arresting people like Chris and Tamara, that I would be on that list. It was much more bothersome to see the use of force that was used against other protesters, like Chris Deering, the veteran, who got kicked and kneed when he was down on the ground, the horse trampling incident. And I actually, not to defend the RCMP, but just for accuracy's sake, that was actually Toronto Police Mounted Unit.
Okay.
But I know everyone thinks it's the Mounties because they're on horseback, and because it was the Mountie chat group that got leaked afterwards.
Right.
A Mountie chat group from the musical Ride, I believe, that were tweeting all the horrible things about jack boots on the ground, etc. after the fact.
Yeah. Hey, we should learn that. We should do that exercise or whatever it was.
Yeah, like very professional. For something, professionalism is supposed to be one of our core values, and it's like, where's the professionalism in that?
Right.
And I mean, and it's just like pure stupidity. Because one thing, we all know that even if that wasn't leaked, all of those communications are subject to an ATIP request. Like just pure stupidity to put something like that in a written form. But
well, it's almost like maybe they feel they're above the law, right? They're on the right side. They're on the right team. They're going to get away with.
If you're making comments like that, you clearly think that you're in the right, or that you're justified. Right? Like if you felt gross about what was happening, then you probably wouldn't be engaging in that type of conversation, right? You'd be trying to avoid it at all costs. You'd be trying to find a way out of that situation. Mm-hmm. But sorry, what was your original question again? Like just how that was for me as a former RCMP to see that happen? Yeah, that was rough. That was a really hard pill to swallow. Because Greg, I've been to other major events and lots of other protests, and I've seen the lack of police response when protesters have been aggressive, both towards other people and like the opposing group, or towards the police. And then so to see what I saw with the response against the trucker convoy, I'll try and. When I saw them mass mobilizing that morning on the 18th, I knew that, okay, this is it. They've had enough. They're going to push through, and they're going to take trucks away. And that to me would have probably been a reasonable response. Like, okay, you're going to push and you're going to take ground, and then you're going to remove the trucks because you're trying to clear the protest. But all of the other things that we saw, like the horse issue, the physical violence and the strikes, the pepper spray, all that stuff,
the butt end of the rifle,
right, all of that against people who were offering virtually no resistance other than just standing there and letting themselves be pushed back. That was very upsetting to me, and that was hard for me to watch. And that was one of those moments where I was like, how much worse can this get? Like, where do we go from here? If we had already seen other kind of like nonsensical responses from police, removing a mother from a hockey rink for refusing to show a vax pass because she wanted to watch her kid play hockey. Watching that young Calgary kid get tackled or taken down to the ground because how dare he be outside skating on an outdoor rink playing pond hockey with his friends.
Yeah.
When that's not criminal, but they bought into the propaganda that everyone was a walking hazard, even though there was no evidence to support that whatsoever. And what just bothers me to my core is like almost every police officer that I know, that I've been friends with or colleagues with in the past, we all know that government is full of shit, pardon my language, and the media lies about everything. They twist everything to their narrative. And so why the intense buy-in on this particular case? Like, why would people be so willing to just hand over their rights and freedoms? I don't know. That's been a struggle for me. That's been the hardest part for me to reconcile from the last couple of years. Is like, how could former colleagues be on board with this?
Yes. So you're saying there's always been this sentiment, even in the police force and the RCMP, that's like, these politicians are maybe kind of, obviously not a publicly held opinion, but like people are like, the politicians are kind of full of it, and the media kind of spins stuff. And I guess police officers kind of know this because they go on calls and then they see how the calls are reported in the news, and they're like, that's not what happened.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I guess that's
widespread. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that the government does what's best for the government, and the media twists everything to fit their narrative that they're trying to sell. Mm-hmm. They sell outrage and fear.
Yeah, and that is a great question. Why is this different? Why has this COVID thing been so different? Why has there been such what I would call, I guess, a moral failing of so many people within these major institutions? And I want to bring up, I was watching another podcast you were doing with Alex Kamana on Patriot Propaganda. Shout outs to Patriot Propaganda. And you brought up the fact that you were listening to an audiobook for the book Ordinary Men, leading up to COVID. I think it was before COVID. But for those who don't know, it's a disturbing tale of how a group of men went from ordinary to brutal, hardened killers executing the Nazi mission during the Holocaust. It examines in detail the evolution of these men's attitudes from the beginning, when most experienced, disgust at the gruesome tasks they were asked to carry out, through to the end when almost all had become accustomed to the cruelty, and some even came to delight in it. Above all, it's a warning and a reminder of what humanity is capable of in its darkest moments. And I think in the podcast you were saying how you were listening to this book and thinking, I never want to be that guy. Like, I hope it never comes to that, which is crazy that you listened to this right before COVID happened.
That's so I was listening to that audio book while I was doing like a personal construction project back in 2020 when I was on my days off.
Okay.
And then, and even prior to that, actually, when I was in Papua New Guinea as part of the PM's protection detail, I was actually reading the book 1984. So, I mean, it's like a lot of things were aligning to kind of create the mindset that I needed, I guess, to say, like, what is happening in Canada? Why is no one actually looking at evidence and willing to say anything truthful? But so Ordinary Men, I think the reason why that resonated with me so much is like, because that wasn't just like Hitler Youth people who grew up like being indoctrinated with the Nazi propaganda and the Nazi ideology. Sure. They were just regular citizens, mostly from Hamburg, Germany, if I remember correctly. And they got sucked into a reserve police battalion as part of the German war effort, and they kind of were tasked with cleaning out the ghettos in Poland after the war machine had moved through. And yeah, I remember I listened to that book. It was a recommended reading from Jordan Peterson, and so I listened to it, and it was horrifying. It was grotesque what these men let themselves become, because they were unwilling to say no when they saw things that were horribly vile and wrong. And I remember thinking to myself, my exact thoughts were, I hope I would at least be strong enough to resist and say no, but more likely someone of my background and training, like, no, I would be part of the resistance. Like, I would be, trying to get people out of there. I'd be trying to extract people out of those situations, or I'd be like ambushing Nazis in the bush, like, the movie Defiance, like something of that nature.
Yeah, and when it comes to the the moral failings or the kind of the conflicts that these men have in this book, what do you think the comparisons are to what's happening within many institutions in Canada? But maybe let's just use the police force as an example, because during the convoy we had this one young woman who was a police officer who made a video saying, "Hey, I support the truckers." And maybe there's like a few other police officers that you could count on one hand that stood up to say something. And I'm pretty sure I don't know, maybe you can fill in the details. I don't know how many consequences they faced for daring to stand up to this. But why don't you think there were more police officers or RCMP officers like yourself who kind of said, I'm out, like, this is not right. This is not what I signed up for. This is not me helping my country.
Well, I do think there was a lot more that left than are publicly known, right? Yeah, like you're correct in saying, like, just a small handful spoke out publicly. But I know there's been an exodus from the police community in Canada over what happened with COVID mandates and the trucker convoy. I think we actually have a much larger support base than is publicly known, but again, it's kind of that, like, silent supporters, which, as much as it is appreciated, it's also like, well, what are you doing? Like, are you at least like trying to fight back against this on the inside, like internally? And that's what I try and encourage them to do, because to go against the grain publicly, you're pretty much guaranteeing that that's the end of your career. But internally is a different story. And so I guess my message to them would be, like, you have so much more power and authority than you think you do. Like, you think you're beholden to these senior managers, but they cannot exist. The police force cannot function without the people on the ground, right? It's much like Canadian citizens as a whole. Like, the government has authority over you because of your compliance with their demands, whereas they don't have the ability to enforce their will on everyone. If enough people were just like, nope, not doing it, that's crossed the line. I guess probably, but sorry, to answer your question, I think the reason why we didn't see more people speaking out against it publicly was, pay and pension is part of it, for sure, like job security, which I can sympathize with, because the last 2 years has been a real slog, and there's been many moments where I've questioned what I did, if it was the right thing to do. I think it was morally, it was the right thing to do, but it's had a serious impact on my family, for sure. But I think maybe even more so than the pay, like loss of income, loss of career, is that social alienation. Because anyone who questioned the narrative, even if they were very reasonable and trying to always present evidence to support their argument against the government's policies, was smeared as, like, right-wing extremist, ideological, motivated, violent extremist, conspiracy theorist, anti-vaxxer, all kinds of pejorative names. And that makes people, like, very few people are comfortable with being attacked like that publicly and just carrying on like that. I think that those intimidation tactics work pretty well on most people. Yeah, and speaking of that, speaking getting called all of these names,
A recent tweet from CSIS says IMVE, which stands for Ideologically Motivated Violent Extremism, is fueled by extreme views around race, gender, and authority. And I mean, how does it feel to be a former RCMP, someone who stood up for the people against mandates, stood up for bodily autonomy, and then in a way, it's not too far away from being accused as being part of an IMVE. Like you immediately you stand up for your country, and in a way, you're being vilified by almost like your former colleagues over there at CSIS.
Well, I part of me knows that I've never done anything to fit the true criteria of what an IMVE would be, and I've never promoted violence. I've never promoted hatred of any kind. But I have no doubt that I was investigated as such. And so, again, it's just, where's your evidence? What evidence are guiding your actions? Like, you need to really think about that. Like, evidence is supposed to matter, and it did in my perspective, previously, it did matter. But when people talk about like Orwellian future, like, it definitely seems like we're kind of on a trajectory of, new, like, I'll give you an example, like Newspeak. Remember that? Have you ever read that book, 1984?
I have, yeah. Newspeak,
so,
yeah.
Like, you're constantly hearing like misinformation, disinformation, and I like that. Those are relatively new terms that just came about within the last few years. It's like, really, what does it mean? Like, information is information, and either it's accurate or it's not. So why are you? But it's just another tactic to try and like divide and smear people. That's all it is. And so I feel like I know, honestly, this might sound jaded, but I just don't have a whole lot of faith in the RCMP and the CSIS or the DND, even, for that matter. Like, I know that there's lots of people that probably work for those organizations that are good, hardworking people that join for the right reasons. Like, I know that's true. I've worked with them. But the leadership or the people in charge of those institutions are just buying right in to this woke Marxist type mindset, where we have to, it's more and more centralized control, right? And you forget about reality, forget about what real evidence says. You tell us what policy you want us to implement, government, and we'll go along with it.
I totally agree with you, and it's to use the term woke to make it simple. It's like this sort of mentality, this Marxist mentality, this corrupted sort of value system that's in a way antithetical to nationalism and actually being truly Canadian. It is infecting all these major institutions. But, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, the opposition, is saying, we're against the woke. We're going to stop the woke. We're against the woke. And it's like, well, Pierre Poilievre, CSIS is starting to say stuff that is woke. The military is starting to say stuff and have these values that are woke. Obviously, you're not going to talk about that because I don't know. I guess it's not good political strategy. But, this is why I really believe that it's much bigger than the next election. If we really want to turn this country around, it's much bigger than the next election because, the opposition is not going to be able to change the face and the value system of CSIS and RCMP once they get elected. At least if they were planning on doing that, why wouldn't they be talking about that now?
That's a good question. I think that those organizations are very prone to trying to appease the government of the day. So I think if there was some concrete government policy that might have an impact on those institutions, but I think it's, like you said, the election is just one piece, right? Like, the current government of the day is just one part of the solution. I think as a whole, our society has citizens have abdicated their responsibility to stand up for themselves and say that something is not true when they believe it's not true, and to be actively interested and involved in what is happening at the local, provincial, and federal levels of government and public policy, because it has an impact on your life. I know people are very busy, and not many people are interested in politics, and truthfully, I was one of those people for a lot of my life. But at the end of the day, their policies do impact your life. Now, I'm trying to adopt the mindset that I'm not going to count on any politician to come save the day on my behalf, and it's on me. It's all on me and my family to make sure that we are independent and resilient, and that we focus on our time and attention on building the life we want, as opposed to constantly worrying about what some talking head in Ottawa or in the provincial legislature is saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah. As Jeremy McKenzie says, expect to self-rescue, or maybe that's a reference to a military term. But I think that's certainly a great mentality. I don't think you should put too much faith in any politician, especially if they're part of the establishment, and especially if they've proven that they're playing all these weird games of not being straight up honest and not really proving themselves to have moral character. And this Conservative Party, man, where is their moral character? Of course, they're concerned about the price of milk. They're concerned about finances. But with everything that's happened over the past 3 years, they don't seem to be able to take any sort of moral stance on anything. I mean, especially when it comes to the COVID stuff. They're acting like the establishment, like it never even happened. Like the National Citizens Inquiry, for example. This is an organization, a great organization you testified at, that's kind of collecting all the receipts, collecting all the evidence of the wrongdoing, of the incompetence, of the potential corruption, of the potential criminality of what's happened over the past 3 years of this government responding to COVID. And the Conservative Party's not going to touch it. They're not going to touch it. They like to talk about the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act. They like to talk about the inquiry into the election interference, but they're not going to talk about the inquiry, the National Citizens Inquiry, that's actually going to try and hold this government accountable with all of these very questionable decisions they've made over the past 3 years, right?
Well, I'm sure they probably have a team of strategists that are advising what to speak, what is safe to speak about and what's not, when I guess the end goal is trying to appeal to the widest voter base as possible. And so that's why some topics are taboo and some aren't, even if it's, I think securing the number of votes is more important than saying it's true. Or, I'll leave it at that, than saying what's true. It's more important to get the right amount of votes to secure the election victory than it is to speak the truth.
Right. And I agree, like that's what their strategy is, but I guess my problem with that is it's about the party winning power. And this party hasn't really proven to me that they are going to help the people. They weren't there to fight the mandates when it was important. They haven't even really stood up to political prisoners after the convoy, even though they used the convoy, or at least Pierre Poilievre used the convoy to gain popularity to win his leadership race for the Conservative Party. So I don't know, more and more, and I say this on the show a lot, I really feel, as much as I detest and vilify Justin Trudeau, there is this sort of gross dishonesty that's coming from Pierre Poilievre, because he is kind of telling an even worse lie. He's saying that he's going to fight the woke. He's saying he's going to save us from Trudeau, but on some of the worst issues, he is the same as Trudeau. But we are going to wrap it up here shortly. I did want to kind of give you just probably one of the worst examples of something that Pierre Poilievre will not talk about.
Liberals burn Bible during a fire bin in Calgary and get caught.
Oh, Josh Alexander.
That's not cool. That's not very nice. That's kind of sick as fuck.
So we have people burning Bibles over in at a demonstration with Josh Alexander. And, the very next day, there was a tweet from Pierre Poilievre who was condemning something that was like Islamophobic happening. And, that's fine if he wants to tweet about that. But like, we have a viral video here of Bibles being burned. And for some reason, Pierre Poilievre is not standing up for this young Catholic kid, Josh Alexander. What do you think is going on here? Why is this something that Pierre Poilievre seems to refuse to talk about?
Well, I mean, I suspect that it's because Josh Alexander's initial stand was in opposition to gender ideology in school, right? Like, yeah, I think his origin story when he kind of became public was he got suspended, I think, for saying in class that he believed that there was only two genders, and I think he was opposed to like transgender boys using the female washroom at the school. I think that's kind of how his story started.
Correct.
And so again, that's another one of those political hot potatoes that a lot of politicians are probably hoping that you're not going to ask them questions about, because it's a sensitive topic which they will be attacked for in the media if they answer, if they give the incorrect answer, as opposed to just, I don't know, maybe I'm too simplistic in my thinking, but if I had any desire to be a politician, I would try and take the approach like, hey, you ask me a question, I'll answer. If you like it, great, vote for me. If you don't, then don't vote for me. Vote for someone else. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to change who I am to appease the mob.
Yeah, that's right. And it's funny that, I guess he doesn't want to talk about that topic. It's a hot potato. And it's like, but Pierre, you're supposed to be fighting the woke, man. You're not gonna stand up for this Catholic who's basically doing exactly that, right? Man. Well,
I guess it's, that in the woke circles, people are more equal than others, and maybe in other circles, some people are more woke than others, or some issues are more woke than others.
Yeah. There's a whole hierarchy of woke, right? But we will wrap it up here shortly. But I did kind of want to go in on a deep topic with yourself, because as someone who has been a member of the RCMP and really put your heart, sweat, and tears and blood into this nation as an RCMP officer, and kind of saw it, saw these institutions fail in an epic way. I want to take us back to the Convoy for a minute, and how there was this amazing grassroots movement, groundswell of support. A lot of veterans came out as well, and they kind of communed around the war memorial, taking care of it, making sure it was nice and clean the whole time. And of course, at one point, the powers that be said, we're going to put fences around this memorial because they made up some nonsense. But of course, the veterans showed up, teamed up, and very courteously and very orderly, they took the fence down. And I thought that was a very kind of symbolic thing that happened there. But what these Canadian veterans were exercising, I think, is the honor that they have for the sacrifices made from previous generations of Canadians and Canadian veterans who made these sort of sacrifices. And that word honor really sticks with me, because when I think about the police officers or the members of these institutions that are doing it for the paycheck, they're doing it for their pension, it's like, well, what about the honor that you have for the country that you live in, and for this, what it's supposed to mean to be Canadian, what it's supposed to mean to be part of this Canadian institution? And this is kind of a big, deep kind of question. But I guess, do you have any sort of, theories or kind of comments to share on what has happened to Canadians? Like, do they not honor their nation anymore? What do you think is kind of like the spiritual problem that we're experiencing here, or do you think it's a spiritual one? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think is kind of part of the issue here?
Well, I'll just speak to my experience and perspective from the policing world. I think the vast majority of people who join a police service do so with that honor in mind. Now, what happens to you over the course of years of a career is you get beat down over and over again, nonstop, by, some members of the public, a lot of the media, some of the government, like people who will capitalize on a situation for political gain. And you eventually, my personal experience is that over time you get jaded and you start to question, like, what am I even doing this for? And then, but you've made a life for yourself, a career for yourself, you're comfortable, you have job security, you have a decent paycheck, and you, even if you're not, some people are maintain a passion for police work throughout their career, and there was things I was definitely really enjoyed about my job, and there was other things that were less exciting. But I've seen a lot of police officers get hammered by their own police force for doing exactly what they were trained to do, because there was a political gain to be made from it, either by a politician or a senior officer who was looking to, earn brownie points with the politicians or special interest groups. So, and I think that might be somewhat true of some veterans too, if they become disillusioned with why they went and fought in wars. But my personal experience from policing and from what I saw other police officers endure was they join because they want to be a good cop. And even when they get beat down, they can still maintain a degree of that, but it does jade you over time. You start to wonder, like, I know I thought that many times, like, what am I even doing this for? Like, am I even making a difference? Like, I just feel like I'm running around putting out, like, figuratively putting out fires or putting a Band-Aid solution on things. And like, the courts don't seem to care. A good percentage of the time, the victims don't seem to care. And everyone says I'm the bad guy. Like, what am I doing in this profession?
Thank you for sharing that. So to wrap it up, let's talk about some solutions. I think you really nailed it earlier when you said, I'm going to work to become self-reliant for myself and my family, because I don't think any politician I don't think it's their top priority to really take care of me or take care of us. Outside of that, outside of your own kind of personal efforts to be self-sufficient, are there any solutions that you see that are viable? Any organizations that you think are kind of forming that show some promise to kind of help get this country back on track? I know you mentioned the National Citizens Inquiry, but aside from that, what are you seeing for the future of Canada that is promising and inspiring?
Well, I think there's a far greater percentage of the population that is engaged in what's happening on a political level and a societal level because of what we've seen these last few years, the infringements on rights and freedoms these last few years.
Definitely.
And I think the resurgence, or maybe not resurgence, but the surge in new independent media voices, because everyone is so tired of the propaganda machines of the corporate media. That's encouraging, because it's just more and more avenues for less biased unbiased information, or more truthful information to get out to the public.
Yeah,
I think the NCI, I think people have been critical of it, asking, like, what power do they actually have? And we don't know what impact it will ultimately have, but at the very least, it's a as it was explained to me by one of my favorite witnesses on there so far, Rodney Palmer, it's like it is probably the single greatest catalog of evidence of the harm that was done by this response and the impact that it's had on Canadians. And so I'm hopeful that maybe some politicians might actually take it seriously, but at the very least, there is a whole catalog of testimony there that could potentially be used in legal proceedings, whether that's lawsuits or maybe even potentially criminal charges in the future. I think
we got the receipts. We got a stack of receipts that we're going to be cashing in hopefully in the future when push comes to shove.
It seems that things operate on a bit of a pendulum, and I think we've gone so far. We're at the breaking point of where people have had enough, and there has to be a correction, right? I think, and what was a conspiracy theory 2 years ago was openly being reported on even in mainstream media now, the Great Reset being the most recent example that I can think of. And it's like, more people are waking up, more people are paying attention. It's a gradual process. But I think one, I guess, kind of solution that I'm trying to preach to people beyond, like, first of all, take care of your own health, like physical, mental, spiritual, emotional health, because I know that has been a major challenge for me. Like, I let a lot of my healthy habits fall away over the last 2 years, and now I'm trying to slowly kind of make myself healthy again. And the personal responsibility and independence, like, I'm trying my best to make myself as independent as possible from government and from banking and from the banking system. Because the government, I made that mistake by putting all my eggs in a government job, government career basket. And then I also have seen how easily the banks will freeze your bank account at the request of the government, even without any due process or criminal charges. And then a third, it's all about communication. We all have to deal with, we're all trying to navigate like a censor heavy environment. And so I encourage people to, like, as much as you can, free speech platforms, right? I know that might be difficult for some with, like, if their business is geared around YouTube or Instagram, but for me, it's like I'm trying my best to only support freedom-oriented businesses, and that includes how I communicate with people. And then on a more micro level, mass communication from me, I don't think it's really changed a whole lot from 2 years ago. I think a lot of the people who follow me now were the same people who followed me back then. Sorry, it's going to rain really heavy here and be loud. But I'm trying to focus more on the individual connections and conversations with people that can't be censored, right, by big tech and by government. So that involves being willing to push outside your comfort zone and have a difficult conversation with people who, maybe you had a relationship with in the past and you would like to repair it or retain it. There's a lot of pretty well summarized information out there now that you could bring to their attention and say, hey, look, you know who I am. You knew who I was before all this. I didn't change. Well, I mean, I didn't fall off the deep end. Here's something I can show you that is a good summary of why I did what I did. So I guess just focusing more at a local level.
Yeah, and trying to rebuild that sense of belonging, that sense of community that I feel was really under attack during lockdowns and everything.
Yep.
But Daniel, thanks so much for being on the show. You can follow Daniel at Bulford Daniel on Twitter. Here's his Twitter here. Is there anything else that you wanted to plug or wanted to say before we get going?
No, not really. That's I'm pretty much an independent now, and that's pretty much the only platform I really use that would be like a more mainstream platform. I've dabbled with Telegram and some others, but I'm trying to minimize my time on social media these days because it's a time suck and it just takes up all of your time and energy and makes you angry about the world. So trying to find a better balance with that.
That's really good advice, and I'm with you there. I'm definitely focusing on the exercise and putting the phone down every now and then to enjoy not the chaos, I guess. But thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for your service, of course, and most of all, thank you for setting a positive example, of a Canadian man who is doing the right thing, even if it's not comfortable. But thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Greg.
And for everyone watching, it is okay to demand higher standards. Thanks for watching, guys.